before I forget. Just a administrative note. For this second module, if you want to receive the video links and the handouts and those things, can you please make sure to respond to the email from Canvas that I sent you? I think Zhao Li and Tangin, I haven't seen if you respond there. You should have received an email from Canvas, and all you have to do is just asking if you want to register. You've been invited, it says, to register for module 2, and you just need to click the button that says accept. So I can resend it if you don't have it in your email, but just want to let you know. I think everyone else has done that who's here tonight. So with that, let me, so I want to continue today our discussion of narratives, really beginning to look at some of the key features in narratives and begin to talk about the exegetical process, which is really these steps here where we left off last time we met last week, where our focus was the just to show you the steps are similar, except there's an additional step compared to what we did before for epistles, and we call it the narrative analysis. So those are going to be some new features, new steps that we're going to look at that focus our attention on how to study a story in Scripture. But before we get to that, I wanted to just discuss the first few steps before that. They are similar to what we've looked at before, but there are a few slight differences. Now, again, the overall process for studying narratives is very similar to when we studied epistles, as you can see from the process noted here, but there are some differences. So I wanted to start our time tonight by just asking about it. When we think about epistles and narratives, what are some of the differences between them? Okay, they're both inspired scripture, but what are some differences between a story in the Bible and an epistle or a letter in the Bible? Anybody have any input on that? How about you, Zali? When you think about a narrative and an epistle, what are some differences that between them? You have any thoughts, Zali?
Right now, no.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Sorry.
No problem. Tangin, how about you?
Maybe slightly different, I think.
Yeah, can you think of one kind of difference?
Um, in the narrative, there will be like the reporter or the narrator, and then he's talking about something else. I think,
Okay,
yeah,
something like that.
yeah. And the epistle is like Paul. He just tell them. He just wrote what he want to write.
Okay, so you mean like epistle is more direct statements, whereas a story is more indirect. So can I say it that way? Epistle gives truth directly.
Yeah.
The
Like
story is indirectly. Okay, that's
yeah,
an important distinction, because in a story, normally you don't have the story tell you, okay, this is the theological point of the story. Often it doesn't happen like that. You have to figure it out. There is a theological truth or truths that the author is giving in the story, but it's not always direct. whereas in an epistle, the truths and instruction is direct. They'll give commands or statements that are a direct truth. So that's a very big difference between stories, narratives, and epistles. Basically, we can say that epistles are letters, but narratives are stories. All right, good. Any other differences anybody has between a narrative and epistle, either in the form or the something like that? Any other thoughts about that?
Narratives are more, narratives are descriptive. Epistles are prescriptive.
Okay. Can you explain what you mean by that? We talked a little bit about that last week, but
like story that describes some historical events, whereas epistle addressing some issues, issues of the church. The New Testament epistle. So in their address, they are like command for the Christian at the church. So in that regard, is it's prescriptive in the sense that like directive from God for Christian, how to live their lives.
yeah. Again, more direct, more straightforward. And like an epistle, you'll give an instruction directly. And so it's prescriptive, it's prescribing what to do, how to respond, what to think. Whereas in a narrative, it's descriptive. It's just telling us the events that took place, often not telling us what to do about those events. So stories are they're more difficult in trying to understand what is the author's point and what am I called to do in response to that point. Whereas in an epistle, the response is given directly. And you mentioned as well, the epistles are directed to the church. And so, whereas stories, epistles are letters to the churches. Whereas stories have a broader audience, so to speak, and written. You have many Old Testament narratives, so they'd be addressed particularly to the Jews. And even in the New Testament, the Gospels, those are directed to churches, but those too are in the form of stories. And some of the Gospels, like John's Gospel, is directed more broadly to non-believers, to encourage them to believe. So we have that aspect as well. And I think also, you think about epistles are formal, right? They all start the same way, right? With the author introducing himself, the audience, and then the formal greetings. They're all clearly defined. Whereas narratives are more informal, not personal. In a narrative, you don't have the author of the story telling you, hi, I'm Samuel, and I'm going to tell you a story about King David, or you don't have any of that. Usually the author doesn't reveal himself typically in a narrative, and it's not personal usually. Now, we do have, like in Luke chapter 1, when he introduces the book, Luke does give a personal remark to the recipient, Theophilus. He tells him, but even there, Luke does not reveal that he's the author. We have to figure that out by studying Luke and Acts. But normally in narratives, you don't have that personal direct interaction. You just have the author tells the story. Whereas epistles are very personal. Epistles, it's much easier to figure out the background of the book and why it was written. Whereas for stories, that's a little bit more difficult to figure out. What is the background of the story? What prompted the author to write the story to his hearers? Who are the hearers? Who is the audience, the original audience of the book? Okay, so those are some of the differences between narratives and epistles, and as a result of that, there will be some differences in how we study narratives versus epistles, and that's really what a lot of this class is going to cover, is those differences in studying narratives versus studying stories. Now there are some similarities between narratives and epistles that I think we want to remember. Can anyone tell us what are some similarities, some common things between narratives and epistles? Anybody have any thoughts about that?
Well, the same timeless truths would be involved. Epistles declare them, and narratives would illustrate or apply them. Because when you're reading about David or Lazarus and the rich man, you've got timeless truths there, principles that are involved, and of course it's illustrating them or applying them. Of course, you got to be careful. I was always told that there's one principal truth that we need to get, and then maybe some other applications, but you need to be careful that you don't, I suppose, stretch it too far. But yeah, I like stories because they really make things come alive.
Yeah, that's a good way to distinguish that. Epistles declare the truths directly. That stories typically illustrate or apply the truth or reveal the truth through the point of the story. So that's important to consider. So both, and this is, I think, the key point, both communicate timeless truths, that there is a theological point to an epistle, just as there is a theological point to a biblical narrative. Just the way that we get to that point and understand it is a little different. But both are intended to communicate, truth from the Lord to us. Just like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, when he was referencing a narrative from the Pentateuch, when he's speaking about Israel, he said, these things were written for our instruction. So he took a biblical narrative and reminded his readers that, look, these stories aren't just stories. They're meant to give us instruction in how to live. And he's speaking there to the Gentile believers. So he's saying this Old Testament story written by Moses originally to the people of Israel, that story does have instruction for us in the church today. So Paul recognized that as well, that both narratives and epistles communicate God's truth. They just bring it in a different way, but both are intended to do that. So that's a very important point. Any other similarities?
I think that both are not so lyrical. Lyrical, they are not a poetry, so their grammar form are quite similar.
Yeah, the grammar is similar. Basically, they're both being communicated. Both are communicated using language and the rules of that language. Okay, so yeah, the way we understand a statement in a narrative and epistle, we're going to use grammar to identify and understand that statement. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. There's not some other interpretive approach. Now, we will talk about this a little bit later, that there was a difference in how or did we discuss that last week? I don't remember now. Trying to think. No, we didn't. When the early church fathers were trying to interpret, especially Old Testament narratives, they had a lot of trouble because they didn't know how that Old Testament narrative would apply to the church. They believed that all scripture was profitable. They knew what the Apostle Paul said, but when they looked at an Old Testament story, they had difficulty identifying what that truth was in the story that would apply to the church. And so they came up with this elaborate system called allegorical interpretation, where they sort of had said every passage, there's a literal meaning of the story, but then there is this other level, this spiritual meaning that's sort of underneath the text. And so they came up with this very elaborate system to interpret and define that spiritual meaning. Now, they weren't using just the normal rules of interpretation, the language and just the things that Shulong mentioned. They came up with this more elaborate system that I'll talk more about that in the future classes. But this is a very important point to remember. The first is that both narrative and epistles, they communicate biblical truth. And secondly, the way they communicate that is they use language in a normal sense, a normal way. We could also identify a similarity is that both are inerrant, okay? Biblical narratives and the epistles are both Holy Spirit inspired texts, all right? So keep that in mind too, which is interesting. That lets us know, God also tells stories, doesn't he? Of course, Jesus demonstrated that principle when he used parables to illustrate or communicate truth. As Dwayne mentioned earlier, that stories are really a very effective way to communicate a particular truth, to illustrate it. And Jesus was a master at doing that, which tells us God himself is a storyteller, and uses that to convey. But both are inerrant, that is, both are God-breathed. As Paul told us in 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture is God-breathed. And again, he was speaking at that time primarily the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is majority is narrative. So that's another similarity. Anything else come to mind? Similarity between narratives and epistles?
Both are authoritative.
Okay, because both are inerrant, both are authoritative, meaning both have a message that we must heed. Okay, just as again, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10, that what was written in earlier times was written for our instruction, meaning God intended for us, when we read these narratives, to respond, to understand what is the point of this narrative, and then what I need to respond to that. Remember James 2, what is it, is it 22? I can't remember, 23. Be doers the word, not just hearers. That includes narratives. Sorry, Joshua, did you have more to add to that? Is that what you were talking about?
No.
And I think too, kind of related to that is that both have the same goal. Again, that is, both are intended to communicate biblical truth. So both have an exegetical idea. That is the author's intended meaning. Okay, the author is writing these narratives with the same intent as the author of the epistle, in that he is wanting to communicate a biblical truth to us, to the original audience first, but then by extension to us. And so that's the same goal. Both Paul, when he's writing an epistle, or John, when he's writing his gospel, or Peter, when he wrote his epistles, or Matthew, when he wrote his gospel, or Moses, when he wrote the Pentateuch, all of these authors have the same goal. That is to communicate biblical truth to us, all right? So I could even add to this, by the way, both are inerrant. That means both are inspired, both are God-breathed. Okay, anything else that comes to your mind? So we do have differences between narratives and epistles, but we also have similarities between them. And so therefore, we're going to see some of the steps, many of the steps in the process will be similar that we did between studying an epistle and a narrative, and some steps will be different. And that's, as I noted before, in this fourth step, we'll have some differences in how we approach studying a narrative versus an epistle. But again, we also will have similarities. And the first similarity is this first step. When we approach, we're going to study or teach or preach from a narrative, the first step we need to do is to, just like the epistle, we need to read and observe the book. We need to read and observe the whole book in which the narrative is given. And so if we can remember that from way back in module 1 when we talked about that, what is the objective or the goal of this first step? Why do we need to read the whole book, the whole narrative, and make observations? What is the intended purpose of that? Anybody? Why not just start studying? Let's say you're in John chapter 3, you want to preach sermon on the being born again. Why not just start by studying John 3? Why should we read and observe the whole book of John? Anybody?
Context.
Okay, context. Meaning what? What does studying the whole book help us to do?
Yeah, to know the contextual flow of the book.
Okay. Yeah, to get, I mean, maybe even more basic, right, is to get familiar with the whole book, right? If there's a purpose to the book, we should know what is written in the book, and even get familiar with the book, and as Joshua was saying, familiar with the order of the stories and how they might connect. Is that what you're getting at, Joshua?
Yep.
Yeah. So just reading the book helps us get familiar with the book, helps us to maybe observe patterns in the book. Sometimes perhaps an author will repeat certain events or statements to kind of try to guide the reader as to what he's focusing on in the book. And sometimes if you just do one story and you aren't familiar with the whole book, you're gonna miss that. Anything else that by doing this first step to read and observe the book, what else, what other purposes or goals might that help us with?
Well, I've been
Anybody?
reading First John for, I think, probably 20 years, and I'm still struggling with the flow of that thing. I have just read Martin Lloyd-Jones' commentary on that, or at least what they have published. And it's amazing how he kind of just hangs on to, this beginning theme of fellowship. And everything kind of comes underneath that heading, but then John has, well, it's intensely doctrinal. There's no story in First John. It's all doctrine.
Yeah.
And it's just really challenging to read it and read it and read it and try to grasp as he circles it. It's kind of like the book of Revelation. John just circles it and he gets closer and closer to his subject. And but he does stick to the theme, and there is a pattern there. And the context is king. There's no question about stories. They fit into a context, and they make good sense if you understand where Jesus is in the whole scheme of things and why he's saying this and telling this. Anyway, it's exciting. I find it very exciting and challenging. It's so rewarding when you finally settle in on it and begin to understand what is being told here. And yeah, well, it's just, well, you got to pray, I tell you. It doesn't come easy.
This is true. I just was referring us to First John because I think you brought up a really good point too from Pastor Lloyd-Jones, because he mentions, this fellowship that John is, said he basically shared Christ, revealed, a testimony regarding Christ and proclaimed him so that they would have fellowship. And he says, with us, and indeed our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son. And it's very interesting, if you go to the end of the book, when John states his purpose for the epistle, these things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know you have eternal life. But he doesn't stop there. Why does he want them to know they have eternal life? This is the confidence we have before him. If we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. If we know that he hears us, and whatever we ask, we know that we have the requests we have asked from him. And I think, as you said, Dwayne, John here is coming around full circle, and he starts the letter by talking about fellowship with one another and with the Father and the Son. And here he reveals that he wants his readers to be confident in their salvation, so that they would not be timid in approaching the Father in prayer and basically fellowship. And so this idea, I think, really is a pattern that we see in John writing this epistle, and his desire is to encourage us to, it's not just a letter to check to see if we're saved. Really, the purpose of that is so that then we would have confidence when we approach the Father. If I know that I'm his child, then I will approach him in confidence as I pray and pursue him. And so I think that's just a good reminder from Dwayne, from just the connection that this is an epistle, of course, but it's the same idea in a story, is that the author has a purpose and a reason behind everything that he writes in his story. Just like John had a purpose when he was writing this epistle. And if you are careful enough and you read it carefully, you can see how the different parts link together. And that's really one of the reasons to start with this step, to read and observe, we really need to be familiar with the book. I learned this lesson the hard way when I was preaching through a particular book, and only until I got near the end of the book, I realized that I missed the point of the book. And so I had to correct some of my earlier messages because I did not rightly understand the whole book overall. And so I took each message, each of the stories before, and just sort of preached them as independent accounts, not realizing how they fit into the bigger picture of the whole book. So reading the whole book and doing it several times, making observations, which I'll talk about in a minute, doing that not only helps us get familiar with the book, but also begins to help us think on a broader scope with looking at the book, where we should start be thinking about, okay, how does this story fit in to the other stories, and what is the author trying to communicate in telling these stories and in putting them in the order he did. So reading through several times, you begin to hopefully see some patterns as you do that. Joshua, did you have a thought? You were smiling.
Oh, yeah, I was just I would like to know what book is that you're talking about.
Oh, Jonah.
Okay. Yes, that's good. Save us from doing the same mistake.
But I've heard other pastors do that. They've said they've been preaching through certain books and didn't realize the point of the book till later on, and that's not the time you want to realize. Hopefully you know the point of the book at the beginning before you start preaching. But it happens to us. I know we're all still learning. But one way that will help us that will help minimize that event would be just at the beginning, read the book many times to get familiar with it. That's really I know Pastor MacArthur mentioned that that's a key for him. That's a key step as he studies a book, as he reads it over and over. I think he mentioned one time when he was preaching through the Gospel of John, before he started, he read the whole book 30 times. Which John's not a short book, but he said by the time he read through it that many times, he was pretty familiar with the events in the book, with the order of those events, the repeated words and ideas. So he said it really helped him. Then after that, when he started studying each story in the book, he had a very good idea. He knew what was coming, and he as he's preaching, he knew what was coming next, and he knew where he had been. And so he highly recommends that. And I agree. I think it's an easy step. It's just reading, right? But it's a very important step. Now, when we read, though, we want to be active in our reading, not passive. What do I mean by that? What would be a passive reading versus an active reading? Anybody?
Yeah, you got to read for meaning. That's one thing we have trouble here. You've got to really pay attention. Highlighting is nice. I like to highlight things that really jump out, or have a notebook and write things that you come across down. If you don't have a notebook and if you don't have a highlighter, I don't know how in the world you guys remember anything. I don't. But you got to read very carefully. And as you guys were talking, I was thinking, how we had pork chop sandwiches today. And this is kind of like that. You have the timeless truth. You put a story in there, and boy, that'll just bring it alive. And then you enforce it again, or the other way around. You have a story, and then you put the timeless truth in there in the middle, and and end with a good story to nail it down. But yeah, they have their places, and definitely we remember the stories a lot easier, and we remember the timeless truths. And so, oh boy, yeah, it's part of a whole, and they fit nicely together. But we've got to use it. Yeah, but you got to read, and you got to, I suppose, like you said, get the paragraphs marked out. All the different transitions. The days. I like the Book of Mark gives you days. So does John. I just love to try to figure out the chronological things. That's a real challenge. That's a real interesting Bible study, to get the flow of things as far as days, because John and Mark give us a lot of days and mark things out, so you can kind of get it, where it fits together. It's kind of challenging. It tells you a lot. So there's all kinds of things you can do, but you got to be active in this. You can't just be doing it, and trying to keep yourself awake. You're not going to be able to. You're going to put yourself to sleep.
Yeah, you mentioned a few very helpful, I think, practical things to highlight or underline or mark things as you notice them. Write thoughts in a notebook. Make comments. Ask questions. That's really the process of making observations. All right. So it's not. I think usually for me, the first few times I just read through the book, and then after doing that a few times, then I start reading, looking for things. Because by that time, if I read the book a few times, I'm pretty familiar with it a little bit. And then as I'm reading, I want to read again, and I just start noticing things. So yeah, if you see certain words repeated, or maybe like if you're reading in Genesis and you notice Abraham lies about his wife, Sarah, right? She's my sister. He does that twice. And then his son Isaac does it. So clearly there's something about that that Moses is wanting us to notice. So you might, as you're reading, you just take note of that. Oh, this is the third time that this particular event takes place in the story. Or maybe there's questions that come to your mind as you're reading the story, like what is this? What is the significance of this event? Or why did he say that? Or something along those lines. But active reading it's not just looking at the words on the page, but it's actually trying to think about those words. And even as you mentioned, Dwayne, trying to understand the meaning or intent. Again, thinking, having the mindset is why did the author say this? Okay, that's a key question that should be in our minds constantly as we're reading and studying. Now, we're not going to, after we read, this, we're not going to go off and now we're ready to preach it. Okay, I've read the Gospel of John 20 times. Now I'm going to preach it. Well, there's other things to do first, but we still need to be thinking as we're reading, and that's what active means. Not just sort of, because after I don't know about you, but if you read a book more than once or twice, it's very easy to sort of, the term go into autopilot, where you're not really thinking as you read. It's just kind of like the words you're just examining or noticing the words, but not really thinking about the words. That's easy to do as you become more familiar. So you have to come up with ways to make your reading active. And so I think Pastor Dwayne's suggestions are very good, highlighting or taking notes or having a notebook is a really good thing. And that's what I recommend. This first step is not only just reading the book several times, but then also actively taking notes and making observations from your reading. All right. And And so there's a few different, one other thing. I think another way to help us read actively is to read different translations. All right, so after you've read it a few times in one translation, you've taken notes, made some observations, go back, read the story in another translation. And if you're familiar enough with the story, when you read the other translation, you should notice if there's any big differences. So I like to do that. You know, you could read in the different English translations, and of course read in Burmese, or I guess it'd be Malaysian or Chinese translation, or whatever your heart language is. But read in different translations, and that will also pique your focus and attention. At least I found it to do that. So those are just some ideas. And then as you're reading, again, make observations when you're doing that. Make specific and general observations of the book. So what I do is I'm reading through, after I've read a few times, I start looking for things. I look for specific things, and I look for things in general. So the specific things I would look for is there anything, do I find anything about the author of the book? He won't give his name, but maybe does the author indicate anything about himself in the book? And we'll see that in an example later. What about the people and places mentioned in the book? Just like in epistles, oftentimes there are names, sometimes locations mentioned in the epistles. I want to do the same thing as I'm reading a narrative. What people are mentioned? What places are mentioned? Any significant themes, repeated words, or similar words? Those are things that I look for. And then general observations, that's just basically anything that catches your attention, anything you find interesting, or as Dwayne mentioned, just sort of the chronology of the book. That maybe is something you start thinking, okay, when did these events happen? And then when did this next event happen? And or questions that come up, things that don't make sense. All right, this is just general, any thoughts that you have. Again, at this step, we're not interpreting and coming up with sermon outlines and all of that. All we are trying to do in this first step is, one, get familiar with the book, and two, is try to begin to think about details in the book, just to understand what the author is communicating. And so really, that's all we're doing at this step, is just letting the author introduce us to his story and help us to get very, very, very familiar with that story, so that when we do the specific steps later, we have a very good foundation in knowing what the author has written in the stories, and sort of how each of the stories relate to each other in his book. Okay. Any thoughts, comments, questions about that? That's first steps, just to read and observe.
I think a map, I always like to have the map there. And when they mention a city or a place, you look it up right away. That makes it a lot more interesting. And then, people, that study on Philemon, that was very interesting. I'd never taken a lot of notice to, names that come out, people that were with Paul and who weren't and who had been, and that's rich. And then, of course, there's always the introduction in a study Bible. Boy, that's important to read that introduction. And I like the Amplified Bible. It really puts in the tenses and all. There's a number of amplified extended Bibles that, of course, in English, I'm talking about English. And of course, the Mandarin is the top. That is the best translation that's ever been translated. And if you guys got a Mandarin tongue, you got a real tool there. There's a lot of clutter taken out of the way with the Mandarin. English adds clutter. You got to be careful about English. It's that they're always throwing words around that, of course, you've got to have your dictionary there. And anyway, it's always a challenge. But yeah, a map to try to make it real, get the dates, the chronological, all that stuff, the flow of things, what's happening in other cases at the same time. And oh my, the Bible is real history, you know. It's not just, it's real history. And the authors go out of their way to give you all these reference points, and we need to, it gets exciting once you begin to realize the flow of things, because this is real people and real places and real times of real problems, and not too much different than what we're facing. Only they was worse. They were going through horrendous times of persecution. That first years of the church when these books were written was very dangerous times, very, very challenging. And okay, very good.
So that's great. Yeah, and as you were talking about the names, you mentioned Philemon, sort of look the importance of noticing who was mentioned in the letter and how that helped us make connections. Well, same thing with narratives. I was thinking, as you were talking about that, Dwayne, I was thinking of David's story. And of course, remember his story with Bathsheba, and Bathsheba's husband, you remember his name? Anybody? Yeah, easy question. Uriah, right? Uriah the Hittite, which by the way, his name is mentioned several times in 2 Samuel 11 in the story. Well, I was reading Chronicles in my Bible reading the other day, and I get to was it First Chronicles, the list of David's mighty men. Guess who's on that list? Remember the 30 mighty men? Uriah is one of those guys. So this wasn't just anybody. This was actually one of David's key warriors and soldiers. One of the mighty men. It was his wife. And on top of that, if you remember, I think is his name Ahithophel. Do you remember when Absalom staged a coup and he took over the kingdom from his father, and David ran off, and he fled for his life. And it says Ahithophel stayed and became a counselor to Absalom. And if you're I don't remember, I think it's in, I don't remember if it's Chronicles, but it also mentions that Ahithophel was related to Bathsheba. Can't remember if he was an uncle. I'll have to look that up. So it sort of gives you some insight into, okay, I could see why Ahithophel would betray David because he knew what happened to his family, what David did. And so if you just pay attention, and it's hard sometimes in narratives because there's so many names, all right? But the careful Bible student, as you study and identify those names, so if you're studying 2 Samuel 11, then you want to look up, okay, where else is Uriah mentioned in the Bible? Is he mentioned anywhere? Then you would find him in that list of the mighty men. Oh, wow, this makes David's sin even worse, if it could be worse, right? He not only committed adultery with one of his soldiers' wives, but one of his key soldiers. And then he had that guy killed, one of his mighty men. That just increases the level of wickedness, really, and David's sin. And then it also explains later why Ahithophel, I think that was his name, Ahithophel betrayed David and became Absalom's counselor. There was a family relationship there. And that's often what if you pay attention when you're reading, then, and even later when you're studying specifically, but note the people mentioned. Note the places mentioned. When a place is mentioned, the original audience may understand the significance of that place, and we may not, because we are, we live much later in a different time and place and culture. But don't just skip over, notice those places. And then when you come back and study that story, for example, in John 4, when Jesus is in Samaria, we should understand the significance of Jesus being, as a Jew, being in that location. That's a big deal. Or the parable, right, of the Good Samaritan. The power and message of that parable really becomes more apparent when you understand, okay, who a Samaritan is in the Jews' mind in that time. So these things are very important. So what I like to do when I'm reading and observing is I won't study the places or the people. I mean, you can if you want, but I at least want to make note of them as I'm reading and observing. And then later, as I study each story specifically, I want to make sure that I spend time going into that. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. This is part of the background context, but you want to be thinking about these things as you're reading as well. This helps you to be active. I think, Dwayne, having a map is a great suggestion. It forces active reading. You say, okay, where are these guys now? And so that, again, encourages us to be actively reading through the text. And the more active you are, the better you're going to remember things. If you're passive, boy, that just goes right through, with the, I don't know if you experience this, but sometimes when I'm reading, and I'll read even like a whole chapter, and then I'll realize I didn't even remember what I read because my mind was distracted. Does that ever happen to you? Maybe just me. I'm not very spiritual, but I read something and go, what did I just read? I don't even remember, and I just read it. Well, that's because I was reading passively, not actively. If I'm reading actively, more of it will be absorbed into my mind. But if I'm reading passively, it's very likely that it's gonna, go in, like, the term, go in one ear and out the other. That, it'll go right into my eyes and then out my nose and my ears because I wasn't thinking. So active reading, that's the theme here. And whatever tools, whatever other things can help you read actively, I want to encourage that. Maybe some of you, Dwayne had a great suggestion about maps. Anybody else have any suggestions that can help us read actively? Anybody have any other ideas? Maybe be careful of how comfortable you are. If you're sitting back in a lounge chair reading or on your bed, what's going to happen? It's time to sleep. So maybe sit up. Maybe even sometimes in an uncomfortable chair, just to make sure you're not getting so relaxed and your mind is getting calm and peaceful, and then all of a sudden, right? Anything else? Any practical suggestions to help you to read actively?
There's a good number of different, what do you call them? Documentaries on the life of Christ. And we've used them at camp or at retreats or when we have a few people together in the evening. the one on John, and it uses Good News to Modern Man, and it does have Mandarin subtitles. And then there's another one in Mandarin that is, well, it just gives the life of Christ. It doesn't follow any particular book that's in Mandarin, but any of those can really give life and reality to things. So those are good. If I've collected those, and I think Shalom's helped me to get some of these in Mandarin. Yeah, they're more than entertaining. They are downright informative.
Yeah.
Even the Passion, if you Mel Gibson's Passion, it really puts some meat into the hate that there was for Christ. Now it mixes in the Virgin, and that's sad, but it really shows how Jesus suffered for us, and it doesn't, it doesn't draw back. It is really brutal, and it was.
Yeah.
It really gives us. I don't know, Tim, have you watched the Passion or the Mel Gibson? Yeah, I've watched, I think 5, 6, 8 times. I don't know. I appreciate that. The guy wasn't even a believer; he was Catholic.
Yeah.
It shows, but he really tried to put some reality in it, and he accomplished his purposes. It was, I tell you, and
it's powerful.
Anything like that helps.
Yeah, I think the Bible Project as well has some very helpful introductory videos on books of the Bible. I would suggest, of course, reading on your own first several times, but then, you could, incorporate some of these other resources along the way. So the key, again, is just the active reading. So that's why observations is so important, because that's very active. If you're actually writing or typing something down as you're interacting with the text, I think it's a very helpful way to stay active. And that's why I say, look, as you're doing the observations, looking for certain things. That's another active way, because you're like, okay, I'm looking for, names or places, or looking for repeated words, so that helps you to also be active in as you read. Okay. Let's press forward for a little bit. So again, when you make specific and general observations from the book, as you do that, as I just mentioned, and once you've done that, once you've gotten familiar with the book, you've read through it several times, whether you read through it 30 times or not, like Pastor John did. I mean, that's obviously the more the better, but there is some limit. Eventually, you have to get to the next steps of the study, or you'll never get to your sermon on Sunday. So obviously we can't spend all day, every day, doing the reading and observation only. We have to move forward. And the next step, just as we did for epistles, is to discover the background context of the book. And you can think of the background context as simply the book's setting, the setting of the book. It's the where, the when, the who, the what. The setting helps us to see what prompted the author to write. What situation was it written in? Who wrote it? To whom did he write it? When did he write it? And as with epistles, we want to look for these following elements of the book's background context. Again, can we determine the author? Sometimes we can. And next time we meet, I'll go through an exercise in the Gospel of John just to show you how there's often things within a book that reveals or gives clues about the author. As I said, most narratives, in fact, I'm trying to think, almost all narratives in the Bible, the author doesn't reveal himself directly. All right. Usually it's, we have to figure out who the author is in some other way. And I'll show you how to do that in the example with John later. But a lot of times, though, the author may make comments related to himself or his situation. Like if you're reading Kings or Chronicles, it'll often say, describe an event or a situation, and they'll say, like I was reading in Chronicles, it was talking about the ark and what was in the ark, and he says, up as it is this day. So even up to the day of the author, he mentions that particular circumstance or situation. And so sometimes you can get a little bit of insight then as to maybe when the author wrote or something about him. So it's much harder narratives. Epistles, it's a lot easier because one, the epistle, the author tells you who he is, but also even two is his tone, his circumstances. That's easier to find in an epistle than it is a narrative. But as you're reading a narrative, just look. Sometimes there will be some clues and some information. It's the same regarding the recipients. They too are not often mentioned directly, but we can get some ideas from some of the things the author has said. And again, I'll show you an example of that in the Gospel of John that we'll go through later, maybe next time. But again, just try to see if you can identify anything in the narrative as you go through it that may indicate. Now, like for example, in Luke gives some information at the very beginning of his narrative that, again, at least tells us, let me just take us there for a moment. If we go to Luke chapter 1, let's just read this and see what we can learn about the author from this. Let me ask Zali, can you read verses 1 through 4 for us?
Yeah. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellently, Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. Thank you.
All right. So here, actually, the author gives us some information. Now, he doesn't tell us, I'm Luke, and we have to figure that out in other ways. But what do we see here about the author in these first few verses? Does he refer to himself at all? What do we see here? Pastor Philip, what comes to your mind? What is the author? Does he reveal anything about himself or refer to himself here?
So in verse 2, for me, I understand that he is a very close friend, or he is closely associated with the eyewitnesses of the servants of the word.
Yes, likely, probably a reference to the apostles, the disciples, right? Because they were eyewitnesses from the beginning. So he has some relationship with them, right? They were handed down to us by those. And notice he says in verse 3, having investigated everything carefully. So what does the author tell us here about his approach to this book?
Yeah, he has done a careful investigation what he is writing.
And we actually see that as we go through the gospel. He includes lots of details, even particular times and locations and historical references. So yeah, even though Luke doesn't say that who he is, we at least see some things about the author here in these verses. How about the recipients? Do we have any information on the recipients here? Anybody?
So how about Theophilus as a direct recipient?
Yes, I think so. Theophilus is mentioned here as a direct recipient, most excellent Theophilus, he calls him. So that word excellent tells us this Theophilus may be of some importance in the culture. All right, so, and here he says, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you've been taught. So the author even gives a reason for writing to Theophilus here. So apparently Theophilus had some exposure to Christianity, to Jesus, and Luke wanted to write out a book so that Theophilus would have a careful account of what Christ had done. And he describes it as the exact truth about the things you've been taught. So we're actually given a good amount of information about the author and even the recipient here in this narrative, right at the beginning. So now many narratives don't do this. They're not, but usually you may find comments in the narrative from the author that give some insights. But here, thankfully, Luke really helps us. And this kind of brings up, I don't remember if I said this to you before, but it brings up a very interesting observation about the New Testament. That the most prolific writer, or the person who wrote the most words in the New Testament, was not Paul. Paul wrote the most books in the New Testament, but actually Luke, if you do a word count, Luke spoke or wrote more words than any other New Testament author, because he has Luke and Acts, right? Which make up, I think, 25% or 26% of the New Testament was written by a Gentile. And the recipient, the original recipient, was Theophilus, who was also a Gentile. That's a Gentile name, Greek name. So the most how do I say this? The most words written from one author is by Luke, and he wrote that to just one man, from one Gentile to another Gentile. So I thought was kind of interesting. Just a little trivia fact that Luke's the only Gentile writer in the New Testament, and he wrote his original recipient was another Gentile, and that's kind of neat. But Luke and Acts go together. As you see in Acts chapter 1, Luke sort of does the same thing. He gives a few details, a few insights about himself. The first account I composed, Theophilus. Well, already now in Acts, we know who wrote Acts. Well, the same guy that wrote Luke. And because we have the first account and Theophilus about all Jesus began to do and teach. So that directly connects us back to Luke chapter 1. So really, Acts you can think of as volume 2 in Luke's writings. The book of Luke is volume 1, where the focus is Christ on earth. The book of Acts is volume 2, where the focus is the work of the Spirit in the word of Christ. And so they're both volumes go together. Both are written by the same author to the same original audience, the same original recipient, Theophilus. And so it's very interesting to consider. So there is information, usually in narratives. You just have to dig a lot harder and pay more attention to it regarding the author and the recipients. Any comments or questions about that? In an epistle, usually there'll be a lot of information on author and recipients. When you study narratives, there won't be as much, but there usually is something, all right? Now, oftentimes you may not have an idea of the author, and when you look at some other resources, it may give you some input, but often there is information in the book that I think is helpful. And I'll show you, like I said, an example from John next time we meet, where John doesn't give his name directly either, but we can see from even the book itself some information that guides us that direction, that it might be John. All right. For a lot of books, usually the author is Zali, no problem. Thanks for have a good week. The author often will give us some clues or some information that direct us, but a lot of times the authors of scripture were identified by others, like the early church identified several of the authors of scripture. Again, we'll go through an example in John with that. Now, the author, the recipients, those are key elements. And again, unlike the epistles, the author recipients are harder to identify, but we can learn some things as we study the book carefully. A third category or example, just like when we're studying the background context for an epistle, we also want to know, what is the historical context? Okay, what is the historical context? When was the book written? Can we figure that out? And again, we aren't given the date of the book at the beginning. It's not always that clear or evident, but there's often clues within the book that give us some indication as to the time period when it was written. Now, if we know who the author is, then that makes it a lot easier, but often we may not know who the author is, but there still are clues often within the book that can help us. For example, let's consider the book of Kings. By reading the book of Kings, is it possible to identify perhaps when it was written? So let me ask this question. What is the earliest possible date it was written? Okay, and for a narrative, especially historical narrative, the earliest date that it could have been written is when the last event occurred in the book, right? What's the latest event in the book? Well, if that event happened, the author's writing about it, that's the earliest he could have written it. So let me give you an example from Kings. So if we go to 2 Kings, and again, remember, 1st and 2nd Kings are one book. They're not two books. They're one book that just is contained on two scrolls. And so our Bibles have a 1st Kings and a 2nd Kings, but actually it's the book of Kings. It's all together one book. Same with Chronicles, same with Samuel. Those are actually one book, but in our Bibles, it's split into two, but they're still the same book. So when you study Kings, you have to study 1st and 2nd Kings as one book. All right, because they go together. Now notice here in 2 Kings 25, the last event mentioned is given at the end here in verses 27 to 30. Fu Wei, can you read these verses for us? This is the last verses in 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 to 30.
Okay. 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 27 to 30. 27. Now it come about in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin,
Yeah, that's a tough one.
king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that evil Merodac, king of Babylon, in the year that he became king, released Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison, and he spoke kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Jehoiachin changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly all the days of his life. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king, a portion for each day, all the days of his life.
All right, very good. Now notice here, the author of Kings gives some very specific details as to the time of these events, right? The 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, the 12th month, the 27th day, the first year, Evil Merodach, king of Babylon, he comes after Nebuchadnezzar. So here we're given some insight into the particular event. This is the latest event in the book. All right. If we look at outside resources, this is around 560 BC. Okay. So that's the earliest the book could have been written. All right. Because this is the last event mentioned. So this would be the earliest date of the book being written would be 560 BC. All right. It couldn't have been written any earlier because later this is the last event mentioned. So 560 BC would be the earliest possible date that Kings was written, since he mentions this event here that took place in 560 BC. Now, what about the latest date it could be? Well, there's no mention here of the return of the Jews to Jerusalem. Okay, this book ends in 560 BC, so it's likely written, sometime right after that, but probably not before the return of the Jews in exile. Now, 2 Chronicles mentions that, but 2 Kings does not. So if we kind of just determine from what we see in the book and what we don't see in the book, we can estimate, Kings, let's see, here we go. Earliest date would be around 560 BC, given what we just read in 2 Kings. Now, the latest date, 539, is the date that Cyrus released the Jews. And there's no mention of that here in the book. So I would say, the likely date is something closer around 550 to 560 BC, something like that. During the latter part of the Babylonian exile. All right. Now, what about, for example, Chronicles? The book of Chronicles is a little different. The book of Chronicles, the earliest possible date for Chronicles, if you go to the very last thing mentioned in the book of Chronicles, in 2 Chronicles, again, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are together. 2 Chronicles 36, by the way, mentions Jehoiachin here. So it talks about some of the events of 2 Kings. But notice, and then it talks about Nebuchadnezzar and the captivity in Babylon. And then the very end of the book, the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So here we're given the last event in the book of Chronicles is actually the return of the Jews from exile. That's 539 BC is when Cyrus made that decree. So this book is written sometime after the exile, whereas Kings is likely written in the time toward the end of the exile. And what's interesting in First Chronicles 3 is we're actually given more insight as we go to First Chronicles 3, verse 17. There's a genealogy here. Oh, genealogy. Oh, those put me to sleep. I cannot read genealogies actively. So we'll skip it, right? Let's be honest, guys. I know sometimes you may skip it or you just read through it very fast. Well, here, if you carefully read this genealogy, you would find actually that it lists 8 generations after Jehoiachin was king of the King Jehoiachin. Notice Joachim is mentioned here, and then there's several generations. If you pay close attention to this list, there's actually 8 generations after Jehoiachin, and that would tell us that this book was likely written then around maybe 400 BC. All right, so I don't want to get into all the details and how we get to that point, but if it's 8 generations, 25 years or so per generation, Jehoiachin, we know, was king around 600 BC, so that would take us to around 400 BC, something like that. So here actually, just in this statement, Jeconiah, by the way, is Jehoiachin, just his different name. Just by studying this little genealogy, we get insight into about when this book was written. Now that's important. That's significant because that tells us 2 Kings is written toward the end of the Babylonian exile. 2 Chronicles is written maybe 150 years after that, after the Babylonian exile. That's important to know when you're actually studying the book, because that will indicate, 1, who is the audience, but also 2, the background context of the audience. I'm going to come back to this at a later point when we talk about Kings and Chronicles, because Kings and Chronicles are books, both of them cover similar events, right? They talk about the kings and events that took place. But Chronicles is written to a different audience than Kings. And the focus and purpose of the author of Chronicles is different than the author of Kings. They both talk about similar events in Israel's history, but they do so for a different reason. Okay? So this will all be written down in the handout. So if you weren't able to follow all the details, I apologize. But you can study the notes a little bit. Hopefully that will help. But the idea I just want to communicate is, if you do a careful reading of the book, there are details often within the books that help us know, or at least have an idea of around the time that they are written. Okay, sometimes we have an exact date when certain events take place, but when the book was written could have been much later after those events. And that's important. Like I said, when we study Chronicles, the author of Chronicles is writing some, maybe 150 or more years after the events took place. Whereas the author of Kings is writing, his book during the Babylonian exile, which also tells you who the audience is. Because if the author of Kings wrote his book in the exile, the northern tribes of Israel are gone, right? They have been taken captive away by the Assyrians 100 years earlier. So the audience in Kings is the people of Judah in the exile. The audience of Chronicles is after the exile, where again, only the people of Judah are there. All of the northern tribes have been scattered, but it's written at a much later time, during the days near the time of Malachi, most likely. So, okay, that's enough. I know you guys are tired, but my main point in this was just to illustrate that if you do study the books carefully, you can find some clues that help you know a little bit about when the book may have been written, and sometimes clues about who the author may have been, or the audience, or things about the author or the audience we can find. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for your patience, for staying with me again. I appreciate that. Any questions or comments before we leave, or have you had enough? Okay. Well, that's good. Let me ask Kaptuk, can you close our time in prayer this evening? And you can pray in whatever language you want to. The Lord understands, even if I don't. So whatever you're comfortable with, feel free.